A flight attendant slashed a black teen's tongue with a razor, sneering that it would teach him to stay quiet. Moments later, the CEO made sure the attendant would scream forever. What happens next will leave you speechless. He sliced at a child's tongue with a razor, sneering that it was a lesson, certain no one would fight back. Subscribe if you believe no uniform is above the law. Leonard Voss had just fastened his seatbelt when he caught the first glimpse of something off. The attendant's smile was too tight, his eyes too sharp, and his steps too rehearsed. The man moved through the business-class cabin with the precision of a knife, brushing past passengers with a practiced efficiency that felt more surgical than courteous. Leonard didn't think much of it at first. Noah whimpered softly in his arms, a sound so quiet it could barely compete with the hum of the aircraft's systems. But it was enough to draw a sideways glance from the flight attendant passing by. Leonard followed the movement with his eyes, watching as the man paused just long enough to sneer under his breath. "Some children don't belong in business class," the man muttered to his colleague, his voice low but not low enough. Leonard's grip on Noah's bottle tightened. His instinct was to respond, but he stopped himself. He had dealt with worse in boardrooms, men who smiled while drawing blood from contracts, rivals who disguised sabotage as strategy. He knew how to choose his battles. For now, he focused on his son, gently cradling Noah's head as he fed him. "Edwin," Leonard said quietly, glancing at his younger brother seated beside him. "Did you catch that?" "I did," Edwin replied, his brow furrowing. "Want me to say something?" "Not yet." Leonard's voice remained even, but his eyes didn't leave the attendant. The plane was still at the gate. Outside the small oval window, the sky was overcast. Raindrops clung to the glass, refracting light into distorted halos. Inside, the mood was brittle. Passengers whispered about weather delays, missed connections, and unfriendly staff. Tension wrapped around the cabin like invisible thread. Every movement from the crew felt stiff, as if rehearsed under duress. Leonard could sense it, the same way he sensed when a merger was about to turn hostile. The man who had sneered earlier returned, this time pushing a tray cart down the aisle. His name tag read Victor Redden. His face was pale and narrow, lips pursed in a permanent expression of disdain. His eyes swept the cabin like a searchlight, stopping only when they landed again on Leonard and his son. Victor's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Would the gentleman like a drink?" he asked, voice oozing false charm. "I'm fine, thank you," Leonard replied coolly. "But if you have a blanket for my son, I'd appreciate it." Victor's smile flickered. "Blankets are reserved for premium passengers." Leonard blinked. "I am a premium passenger. So is my son." Victor's expression didn't change. "Noted." Then he turned and walked away without another word. Leonard stared after him, jaw tightening. Across the aisle, a man with graying hair and a cane gave Leonard a subtle nod of sympathy. Leonard returned it with a faint nod of his own. He wasn't imagining things. The problem wasn't Noah. It was something else. Or rather, someone. Edwin leaned in. "That was deliberate." "I know. You want me to log it?" Leonard hesitated, then nodded. "Start a timeline." Just in case, Edwin opened his phone discreetly and began typing. Leonard returned his gaze to Noah, who had finished feeding and was beginning to doze. He gently wiped the baby's chin and nestled him into the crook of his arm. The child's tiny fingers curled around his father's thumb, a soft, trusting grip that sent a sharp pang through Leonard's chest. He had built an empire from the ground up. Solivane Industries wasn't just a company, it was a symbol, proof that someone with nothing could create something vast. Yet, as he sat aboard this airplane, surrounded by whispers and sneers, Leonard realized that some people still only saw skin, power, or perceived place. Noah stirred again and let out a faint cry. It was the kind of sound any parent might hear a dozen times a day. But in the cabin's strange quiet, it cut through the air like a siren. Victor, stationed at the front now, turned his head sharply. His smile was gone. In its place, something colder flickered. Leonard didn't look away. Victor leaned to whisper something to another crew member. They both chuckled under their breath. Leonard's stomach turned. The other attendant, a man with a rounded face and a tired posture, didn't look amused. But he nodded anyway. Leonard filed the moment away. He didn't like the feeling building in his chest. It wasn't anger. It was something older, something heavier, a warning bell that had never failed him before. "This flight's going to be long," Edwin muttered. Leonard nodded once. Yes, but not for the reasons they think. As the engines rumbled to life and the plane began taxiing, Leonard closed his eyes briefly, pressing his lips to the top of Noah's head. The scent of baby shampoo and soft fabric grounded him for a moment. He had survived financial collapses, political smear campaigns, and corporate betrayals. But what he sensed now wasn't economic warfare. It was personal. And it was just beginning. The cabin lights dimmed. Victor passed once more, pausing at Leonard's row. "If the child becomes a disturbance," he said smoothly, "we may need to intervene." Leonard looked up slowly. "You won't touch him." Victor smirked, unbothered. "Just doing my job, sir." Leonard didn't blink. "Some jobs aren't worth keeping." Victor's face twitched. Then he walked away. Edwin spoke low. "That was a threat." "I know. What do we do?" Leonard didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his son, still sleeping, unaware of the storm building around him. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "We watch. We wait. And if it comes, we end it." He turned back to the window as the plane lifted into the clouds, turbulence jostling the frame lightly. Yet the tension inside the cabin remained heavier than anything outside. He had faced hostile takeovers, betrayal in boardrooms, and financial wars, but never imagined danger would strike here, 30,000 feet above the earth. Sometimes the worst betrayals wear uniforms and smiles. Victor moved with eerie calm, the soft creak of the airplane floor beneath his polished black shoes lost beneath the gentle hum of the engines. His face wore a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. The napkin in his hand, folded crisply and tucked around something hidden, swayed slightly as he walked past rows of passengers, his steps too casual to alarm anyone. Leonard didn't see the blade at first. He was too focused on Noah, who had just started to fuss in his arms, the baby's cheeks pink with frustration, his little fists clenching and unclenching against the blue cotton of his bib. Then Victor crouched beside them. "You won't backbite others if you can't cry at all," the attendant whispered with a twisted smirk. Leonard barely had time to process the words. Before he could recoil, before he could raise his voice or shield his son, Victor moved. In a single, horrifying motion, he swept the napkin away, revealing the thin glint of a razor blade clenched between two fingers. Then, without hesitation, he drew it across Noah's tongue. The sound that followed wasn't a cry. It was a shriek ripped from the core of the child's being, raw and broken, laced with pain too great for such a small body. Noah convulsed in Leonard's arms, his mouth gushing blood that soaked his bib and ran in a crimson trail down his chin. The plane didn't just go silent, it froze. Passengers turned, mouths agape, but no one moved. No one screamed. It was as if the air had been stolen from the cabin. Leonard's world slowed to a crawl. His breath caught in his throat as he looked down at his son's mangled mouth, the small tongue already swelling, blood bubbling between Noah's lips. His hands trembled, then steadied as he ripped off his tie and pressed it against the bleeding. Noah writhed, his body shaking against Leonard's chest. The helpless sound of pain tore into Leonard's soul. Across the aisle, Edwin stood, his mouth open in disbelief. What did he just—" he stammered, but his voice faded beneath the ringing in Leonard's ears. Victor straightened, tucking the now bloody blade back into the napkin as if he had merely wiped a spill. "Lesson learned early," he said, not even looking at Leonard. Leonard's eyes locked on him, disbelief giving way to something darker, something colder. His breathing slowed. Every cell in his body screamed to act, to strike, to end this man where he stood. But one glance at Noah's tiny, bleeding face kept him anchored. Impulsive revenge could risk everything. The baby needed pressure on the wound. Calm, control, something Victor had just stolen. Victor didn't stop walking. He moved up the aisle toward the galley, dropping the napkin into a trash bag hanging from a service cart. He blended back into the machinery of the flight like nothing had happened. Crew members said nothing. They watched, eyes blank as if they had seen it before, as if they had been told to ignore it. Leonard sat still, his mind racing even as his body refused to shake. Noah sobbed softly now, a terrible wet rasp, the sound of a child robbed of comfort. Leonard pressed his lips to his son's forehead, whispering nonsense words, calm words, anything to muffle the roar of rage inside him. He cut his tongue, Edwin finally said, his voice hoarse with shock. He knelt beside them. Leonard, he cut his tongue. I know, Leonard said softly, eyes still on the aisle. I saw. We have to tell someone. We have to stop him. Not yet. Leonard's voice was cold now, steady like stone beneath ice. There's more going on here. The people around them shifted, uncertain. Some passengers leaned forward slightly in their seats, glancing between the bloodied baby and the retreating back of the flight attendant. They looked scared, but something in Leonard's stillness held their attention. Edwin looked at his brother. This was planned. Leonard didn't answer directly. He wanted control. Pain gives control. The baby whimpered again, eyes fluttering closed. Leonard's hand never left the wound, applying steady pressure with the bloodied silk tie. The vibrant blue of Noah's bib was nearly purple now, soaked through with red. We're filing charges the second we land, Edwin said, his voice gaining strength. There are witnesses. He's finished. Leonard slowly shook his head. If he was worried about the law, he wouldn't have done it in front of everyone. Behind them, a soft rustle. A teenage boy a few rows back lifted his phone slightly, trying to be discreet as he recorded the scene. Leonard's eyes flicked to the camera lens, then back to the boy. He gave a single, sharp nod. The boy understood. Start recording everything, Leonard whispered to Edwin. Quietly. You think this goes higher? I know it does. The silence in the cabin stretched on. No flight attendant returned. No one offered help. It was as if the crew had gone dark, hiding behind protocol, shielding the predator among them. Leonard adjusted his grip on his son, his eyes focused straight ahead. Victor might think he had won, might think that pain would make Leonard retreat. But he didn't know the man he had just crossed. He didn't know that Leonard had built empires out of chaos. That pain, for Leonard, didn't end fights, it started them. Edwin leaned closer, his voice a breath. What now? Leonard's hand, bloodied and shaking, closed into a fist. Now, he said, we make sure he never does this to anyone else again. He sat straighter in his seat, his eyes burning not with grief, but with clarity. And far ahead in the aisle, Victor paused, glanced back, and smirked, believing, foolishly, that he had broken a father. He hadn't. He had only awakened a reckoning. The silence of power was shattered by a scream that was never meant to fade. The blade flashed red in the artificial light. Noah's scream pierced the air, a raw, torn sound that did not resemble a baby's cry, but something older, more primal. Leonard's eyes widened in disbelief as he saw the crimson streak running down his son's chin. Blood trickled onto the pale blue bib, soaking it with slow, spreading horror. Victor stepped back, a glint of the razor still visible between his fingers. His mouth curled into a twisted smile as he tilted his head and whispered coldly, "A lesson for the boy." Better he learns early, Leonard's body moved on instinct. He yanked his tie from his neck and pressed it tightly against Noah's mouth, trying to slow the bleeding. The fabric quickly turned dark, but the trembling of his infant son's body told him more than any stain ever could. His heart pounded so loudly that it drowned out the surrounding chaos. He couldn't afford panic. Not yet. Not here. Across the aisle, Edwin shot up from his seat, eyes blazing with fury. "You lunatic!" he roared, lunging at Victor. The younger brother's hands reached for the blade, but Victor was fast. He sidestepped with ease, the blade still clutched like a trophy. The attendant's face remained maddeningly calm, as if what had just happened was part of a rehearsed performance. Edwin stumbled into a row of seats, caught by the shoulder of a startled passenger who sat frozen in place. Leonard looked up, scanning the cabin. What he saw deepened the knot in his gut. The other attendants stood motionless. Not one of them moved to intervene. Their faces were masks of false confusion, their feet nailed to the floor. A man near the front looked over his shoulder, eyes wide with horror, but he said nothing. A woman across the aisle clutched her child to her chest, silently crying but unmoving. Even the elderly man with the cane, seated in 2C, gripped his armrest until his knuckles turned white but remained seated. Fear had turned the cabin into a mausoleum of silence. Leonard's grip on Noah tightened. He whispered softly to him even as his voice cracked, "It's okay. It's okay. I've got you. I've got you, son." But inside, rage boiled. It wasn't just anger, it was something deeper, colder, a fury sharpened by strategy. He had built empires from nothing. He had turned collapsing subsidiaries into international giants. And now he would do the same with this moment. He wouldn't lash out blindly. Not yet. That would make him a threat in their eyes, a liability to be restrained. No, if he struck back it would be with precision and finality. Victor lingered a step away, still holding the razor, still daring someone to move. His confidence wasn't just arrogance, it was assurance, as if he knew no one would dare challenge him, as if this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Leonard locked eyes with Edwin, who had returned to his seat, chest heaving, fists clenched. "He thinks we're trapped here," Edwin hissed under his breath, "but we can turn this. We can flip it." Leonard nodded once. It wasn't the time for speeches or plans spoken aloud. It was time for silence, for watching, for calculating. His mind was already rearranging every detail of the cabin like chess pieces. The location of the food cart, the metal cutlery in first class, the narrow aisles, the weight distribution of people, the silence of the crew, the fear of the passengers. He looked down at Noah, whose small hands had stained Leonard's shirt with red. The child whimpered, eyes swollen with pain but still open, still watching. Leonard bent closer and kissed his son's forehead, then looked up with eyes no longer wide with shock but narrowed with intent. Victor leaned against the galley partition, the blade no longer raised but not hidden either. He was baiting them now, playing predator among prey. A soft metallic click interrupted Leonard's focus. At the back of the cabin, a nervous teenage boy, maybe 15, was holding his phone low, screen pointed forward. His hands trembled, but he kept recording. His lips were parted slightly, breath shallow. He didn't seem to realize the full danger he had entered, but what he held was more powerful than any weapon in that moment. Evidence. Leonard's eyes met the boy's. No words were spoken, but a silent message passed between them, an understanding of what had to be done. The plane continued through the clouds, but inside, something had changed. This was no longer just a flight. It was a warpath. And Leonard Voss would not let the blood of his son stain the floor without consequence. Somewhere deep inside, in a place colder than steel and quieter than the grave, he made a promise. To Noah, to Edwin, to himself. This would not end with apologies. It would not end with silence. When cruelty draws blood, justice begins to sharpen its edge. Victor believed himself untouchable. He sneered, returning to the galley as though nothing had happened, wiping his hands on a napkin like a chef after preparing a meal rather than a man who had just mutilated a child. The cabin lights flickered slightly as the plane continued its steady ascent, but the atmosphere inside remained thick with something far heavier than altitude. Dread. Noah whimpered weakly, his tiny body trembling against Leonard's chest. Blood soaked into the folds of his blue bib, and the faint gurgles of pain escaping his throat stabbed at Leonard's composure with every second. His son's cries had gone from loud to fractured, as if even the ability to express pain had been stolen. Leonard's jaw locked tight. His hand, pressed protectively against Noah's back, shook not with fear, but with the tremor of a man holding back a storm. Edwin leaned in close, voice low and urgent. "If we get to the ground alive, we can blow this wide open." Press legal. Everything Leonard didn't respond at first. His eyes weren't on Edwin, they were scanning the cabin like a tactician on a battlefield. He took in the terrified glances from fellow passengers, their silent stares locked onto the scene but afraid to move. The overhead bins jutted out like ledges above a canyon, and beneath them sat rows of souls frozen in moral limbo, torn between self-preservation and the urge to stand for what was right. But Leonard knew he couldn't wait for ground, for justice that might never come. Not when danger was breathing down their necks at 30,000 feet. Not when Noah's lifeblood had already marked the cost of hesitation. He shifted the baby gently, brushing his lips to his son's bloodied forehead, a silent apology, a silent promise. Then, with a steely whisper, he passed Noah into Edwin's arms. "Keep him safe," Leonard said. His voice was raw but steady, like tempered steel. Edwin held the baby close, nodding wordlessly, eyes wide with a mix of fear and resolve. Leonard's focus turned forward again. The serving cart stood unattended near the aisle divider, filled with unused utensils, steel cutlery still wrapped in paper sleeves, glass bottles nestled in slots. He took a slow, deliberate step toward it, testing its weight as his fingers curled around a bottle of red wine. The cool glass felt dense and balanced, like a hammer waiting for purpose. He didn't rush. He couldn't afford to. One wrong move could provoke the others. His mind raced, calculating. He whispered quietly to the man across the aisle, an elderly gentleman who hadn't said a word since boarding. "When I move, help who you can." You'll know when the man's hand trembled slightly on his cane. His gaze locked onto Leonard's, and slowly, he gave a nod. Meanwhile, Victor strolled back toward the forward cabin, his uniform crisp, his mouth curved in a smirk that barely hid his disdain. He paused beside a young father struggling to calm his toddler and gave a dramatic sigh. "Can't anyone control their children these days?" Victor mocked, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. He leaned closer to the child, his voice soft but venomous. "Maybe this one needs the same lesson." The father's eyes widened in alarm. He pulled his son closer, shielding him instinctively. The air in the cabin shifted again, tension sharpening like a blade. Leonard's pulse pounded in his ears, but he remained motionless, waiting for that final trigger. Victor turned just slightly, catching Leonard's stare across the cabin. Their eyes locked. The smirk returned. Leonard didn't blink. Victor dismissed him with a scoff and resumed his pacing down the aisle, his hands casually brushing the folds of his uniform. Edwin, watching from the corner, spoke softly behind his breath. "He's daring you." "No," Leonard murmured. "He's mocking every father here." Victor continued on, inspecting the passengers like cattle in a pen. Leonard noted how he moved, how his eyes narrowed when he passed children, how his fingers curled when he neared the weak. It was a performance, a display of power, and Victor believed he was the only man on this stage. But dramatic irony hung thick in the recycled air. Because Victor, for all his arrogance, didn't know the storm was already forming behind him. He didn't see how Leonard's movements had shifted from reactive to deliberate. He didn't realize his cruel lesson had summoned something he couldn't contain. Leonard's objective had changed. This was no longer about one child, or one wound, or one insult wrapped in a smile. It was about stopping a man who believed violence could hide behind a name badge and polished shoes. Victor paused near another row of seats, fingers twitching as he leaned over a mother trying to comfort her son. Leonard stepped forward, unnoticed, silent. Edwin tightened his grip on Noah and whispered a prayer. Victor reached for the child's toy on the floor, lifting it mockingly. "What is this? A pacifier for failure?" Leonard moved like thunder, quiet until impact. His hand tightened around the wine bottle, his steps sure and direct. His eyes never left Victor's figure. No shout, no warning. The strike would come when the moment revealed itself, and it was nearly here. He felt the cabin narrow into a single corridor of consequence. He could hear his heartbeat sync with the engine's hum, could see every calculating movement in Victor's limbs, could smell the sterile air mixed with Noah's blood. The cage had been locked, but the lion inside was now awake. Leonard leaned forward, his voice low, steady, and deliberate. "Don't panic," he whispered to the young father seated 2 rows ahead. "Just watch for my signal. When I move, help who you can." The man blinked, unsure whether to respond. His eyes darted to the aisle where Victor was pacing again, his polished shoes clicking softly against the carpet like a countdown. Leonard didn't wait for a reply. He turned to the passenger behind him, a man in his 60s, gaunt, with trembling hands resting on a carved wooden cane. The older man met Leonard's eyes. His expression was weary, hollowed out by decades of hard truths. But slowly he nodded, his fingers tightening around the handle of the cane. No words were spoken. They weren't needed. The alliance had been formed. At the same time, Edwin hunched protectively over Noah, shielding the infant's bandaged face with his jacket. With one hand, he held the child close. With the other, he tapped furiously on his phone, sending a coded message to Marcus Hallworth, Sullivan's head of security. The text read, "Emergency on Flight 721. Immediate threat. Evidence required. Prepare for worst." But they both knew that the message might never reach its destination before touchdown. Victor moved down the aisle with theatrical confidence, hands folded behind his back like a conductor overseeing an orchestra of silence. His eyes scanned the passengers, lips curled in smug delight at their submission. He stopped to adjust a baby's blanket, sneering as the child whimpered and the mother recoiled. Leonard watched it all, jaw clenched. He was waiting, calculating. The time for rage had passed. Now came the time for precision. His eyes narrowed as something caught his attention, a subtle movement 3 rows ahead. Another flight attendant, pale and heavy-set, stepped beside Victor with a forced smile. In one swift motion, barely noticeable, the man reached into his apron and slipped a small metallic object into Victor's right pocket. Leonard's breath caught. A blade. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from confirmation. This wasn't an isolated act of cruelty. This was coordinated, authorized, protected. He leaned slightly toward Edwin, keeping his voice low but firm. "They're working together," he said. "This goes deeper than Victor." Edwin nodded grimly, his face drained of color. "They've done this before." Leonard's hand moved slowly toward the serving cart stationed at the front of their row. A bottle of red wine stood half-loosened in its slot, the glass thick and cold to the touch. He wrapped his fingers around it, testing its weight with a subtle lift. Heavy, solid, enough to make an impact. Across the aisle, Victor paused again, turning to glance at Leonard. His smile was faint but dripping with contempt. He mouthed something, a silent taunt. "Still think you're in control?" Leonard met his stare without blinking. Then he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had just found his advantage. A quiet, dangerous smile that made Victor's own falter for half a second. "Victor's watching you," Edwin whispered from behind, "but he doesn't know you're watching everyone." Leonard's grip tightened on the bottle. The pieces were shifting. He could feel it. Dramatic irony filled every corner of the cabin. The man who thought himself invincible was being studied like a cornered predator. The passengers, once paralyzed by fear, were beginning to steal glances at Leonard, recognizing in him not just a fellow victim, but a possible savior. Still, Leonard knew better than to act too soon. One mistake, one misstep, and Noah could pay the price. Timing was everything. From behind, a steward pushed another cart toward the mid-cabin galley. Leonard stepped aside just slightly, repositioning the first cart into the aisle behind him, locking it in place with his foot. A narrow corridor was forming, one Victor would have to walk through. The overhead lights flickered briefly as the plane hit another patch of mild turbulence. It was nothing dangerous, but it added tension to the moment, like the tightening of a drum before a war cry. Victor began his return down the aisle. His strides were slower this time, more calculated. He brushed his fingers along seat backs, tapping occasionally, a rhythm only he understood. Then he turned slightly, facing Leonard's row once more. "I see you're still here," he said aloud, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Thought you might have fainted." Leonard tilted his head. "I don't faint." Victor smirked and leaned in closer. "Your son's cry was annoying," he hissed, just loud enough for Leonard to hear. But the silence. Beautiful Leonard's smile didn't waver. He tapped the wine bottle gently against his knee. Victor didn't notice. He turned, smug again, continuing his slow walk down the aisle toward another young family. Leonard leaned toward the old man with the cane. "Be ready," he whispered. The man lifted his cane slightly, a spark of purpose glinting in his eyes. Leonard turned back toward the aisle, heart steady now, his breath slow, his mind clear. He didn't know how much longer they had until landing, but he did know one thing. He wasn't going to wait. Not anymore. The bottle's neck slid into his palm like a sword returning to its master. Victor was 3 steps away, back turned. He would pass by Leonard's seat in seconds. "Now," Leonard whispered. The man who thought himself untouchable was about to be touched by fear itself. Glass exploded. Victor's wrist snapped back under the blow, the wine bottle shattering into a burst of glittering shards that skittered across the aisle. The razor slipped from his fingers and spun end over end, a bright sliver pinwheeling through the air before clattering against the floor and vanishing beneath a seat. He roared, a short animal sound, his mouth twisting, his shoulders hunching like a cornered dog. The passengers closest to him recoiled into their seatbacks. A child whimpered. An overhead light flickered as if the aircraft itself flinched. Leonard did not pause. He drove the service cart forward on locked elbows, wheels screaming, and slammed it into Victor's chest. The jolt shook the metal frame, sending stacked cups and a tin of tea bags scattering like startled birds. "Stay back," Leonard said, breath tight but voice steady, his eyes never leaving Victor. His words were meant for everyone. For the trembling father cradling a boy 2 rows ahead, for the gray-bearded man gripping a cane with white knuckles, for Edwin across the aisle holding the infant close. Leonard's heartbeat thudded hard enough to feel in his throat, a drum counting out the seconds of a plan that had turned into a sprint. Victor's face went pale, then blotched red. He tried to push the cart away with his forearms, but the angle trapped him against the bulkhead. "You just made a mistake," Victor hissed, the words squeezed through clenched teeth, his breath fogging the polished chrome. He twisted, testing the edges of the cart, his eyes darting. Not with fear, Leonard realized, but with calculation. It was the look of a gambler searching the room for his next card. From the corner of his vision, Leonard saw Edwin rise halfway, then force himself back into the seat as the baby stirred. Edwin's jaw worked as if he were biting back words. "Leonard," he called, voice low and urgent. "Left side. Watch your left." Leonard shifted his stance without looking away from Victor. The aisle smelled of spilled wine, citrus cleaner, and the faint hot tang of stressed electronics. He heard a soft click behind him, the latch of a galley cabinet, and the whisper of shoes on rubberized flooring. His mind broke the moment into slow, separate parts. Victor's right shoulder angled down. The cartwheels drifted a fraction. The air carried a hint of antiseptic he hadn't noticed before. "Everyone stay seated," came a voice behind Leonard. Calm, almost pleasant, a voice trained to reassure and, for that reason, more threatening. "There is no danger if you remain still." Leonard did not turn. "No danger," he said, and let the words settle like ash. In the chrome reflection of the cart, a figure moved closer. The second attendant, expression smooth, eyes cool, posture tidy. The man stepped into the aisle the way a chess piece slides across a board, measured, inevitable. What he held in his hand was not a blade. It was a slender tube capped in steel, the barrel filled with clear fluid that glinted under the cabin lights. "You're done," Victor croaked, finding his voice again. He tried to smirk but only managed a slippery curl of the lip. Sweat trickled along his hairline, catching in the stubble along his jaw. "You just wrote your own report." Leonard pressed harder on the cart and spoke without raising his tone. "Move, and I will break your ribs." He meant it. He also knew the cart could buy only seconds, not safety. The second attendant stopped just a step beyond striking distance, presenting the syringe at shoulder level without pointing it anywhere in particular. It was a quiet threat, the kind that turned air into glass. "Sir," the second attendant said, addressing Leonard as if they were discussing seat assignments, "place the cart aside and return to your seat." "You are frightening our guests." A short, humorless laugh escaped Leonard. "Our guests," he repeated softly, and the repetition steadied him. He watched Victor's hands, cataloging every twitch. He watched the second attendant's shoulders, which were too relaxed. He watched the syringe, a single glimmer of leverage that didn't belong on this plane. "What's in it?" he asked. "Say it out loud." "A sedative," the second attendant answered, not missing a beat. "For medical emergencies." "An emergency you caused?" Edwin shot back from behind, voice shaking with controlled anger. He stood a little now, angling his body to keep the infant shielded from the aisle. The baby's small fists nudged at Edwin's shirt. His breathing made soft, struggling sounds that cut through the noise more sharply than any shout. The second attendant's eyelids flickered, too fast for most to see, clear to Leonard. The man's gaze drifted not to the child, but to the row where the razor had disappeared. He was counting tools. He was counting witnesses. He was counting time. A ripple passed through the cabin as passengers shifted, phones raised in hands that could not stop trembling. The older man with the cane extended it into the aisle as if shepherding a line of sheep, a small, shaking barrier between danger and the family 2 rows up. Somewhere toward the rear, a chime went off, a call button pressed and unanswered. The aircraft hummed and pitched a degree, a subtle change most would ignore. Leonard felt it like a warning. "Sir," the second attendant said again, smooth as glass, "roll the cart back. Put your hands where I can see them. If you do not, I will be forced to intervene for the safety of everyone on board." "And the syringe?" Leonard asked, because every question was a stall and every stall was a chance for the truth to gather witnesses. "Where does that fit in your safety speech?" He let his weight tilt a hair to the right, enough to feel the cart's balance shift. Victor's chest rose against the metal bar, shallow and fast. Leonard pictured the path between his foot and the cart wheel, the way a quick kick could wedge it, the way an instant of pain could travel up Victor's spine like a wire tightening. The second attendant did not blink. "Some passengers," he said as if reciting a training manual, "require firm care." A man in a business jacket halfway down the aisle said, "This is wrong." then fell silent when the second attendant cut him a quick surgical glance. The glance said everything. "We know how to make you quiet. We practice it." Leonard drew a breath that reached the lowest part of his lungs. He spent time every day on numbers, on risk, on the swallowed pride of boardrooms where men smiled while twisting knives. That training hadn't prepared him for this, but it had taught him this much. The first truth to accept in any fight was not that you could win. It was that the other side was ready to lose anything to keep the game fixed. "Edwin," Leonard said, eyes on the syringe, "when I move, you move the other way." "Understood," Edwin replied, and Leonard heard the shift in him, the choice to be brave even if courage shook your fingers. Victor chose that moment to slam his shoulder into the cart. It jerked an inch. The metal edge bit Leonard's forearm, and the sting startled him more than the pain. He shoved back, heel grinding against the aisle runner, and felt the cart settle again. Victor bared his teeth in something like triumph. "He's not going to do it," Victor said to the second attendant, loud enough for those filming. "He likes an audience." "He won't risk." Leonard kicked the cart's left wheel hard. The frame jumped, twisted, and dropped crooked. The left front caster lodged against a floorbolt with a squeal that made nearby passengers flinch. Victor tried to jerk free and failed. His breath came in harsh bursts. The second attendant took 2 quick steps forward, no calm now, only purpose, and raised the syringe a little higher. "Last warning," the man said, voice no longer soothing. "Step back." Leonard angled his body, one hand on the dented cart handle, the other open, palm forward. He let his gaze meet the second attendant's eyes and held it there long enough to say what he didn't risk saying out loud. "I see you. I know this is not improvisation. I know this is policy." "You think I'm the problem," Leonard said, speaking to the cabin more than to the man. "But the problem is the hand that hides the needle." The second attendant's jaw tightened. The plane's ventilation hissed, a steady white noise that turned every breath into a metronome. Behind Leonard, a seatbelt buckle clinked against an armrest. Ahead of him, a father squeezed his son's shoulder, whispering something soft and steady to keep the boy from crying. In that fragile stillness, the second attendant showed Leonard the future. A quick step, a plunge, a euphemism in a report, a lesson, firm care. Leonard shifted his weight to the balls of his feet. He did not announce his decision to himself. He simply made it. In the polished steel of the cart, he saw the man's hand tighten on the syringe. He saw Victor testing the cart again. He saw the thin seam at the base of the galley where a metal door met a brace, a hard corner he could use. His mind mapped routes the way it mapped mergers: forward, hook, press, retreat, pivot, trap. There was no guarantee. There was only a series of doors, each opening if he slammed hard enough. He feinted a step to the right. The second attendant tracked the motion, shoulders rising. Leonard snapped left, caught the cart's side, and yanked. The frame skated a fraction, enough to shift Victor's balance, and Leonard heaved it back in. The top edge struck Victor's collarbone with a clang that echoed down the cabin. Victor gasped, all the air leaving him at once, and his hands flailed for purchase, catching only slick aluminum. In the same heartbeat, Leonard lunged toward the second attendant, stopping just a half step short. It was not a strike. It was a demand for information. The man's eyes widened, then narrowed, a calculation finishing in the time it took the aircraft to hum through a pocket of warmer air. He lifted the syringe a fraction higher and spoke, finally dropping the pretense of customer care. "Stand down," he said, low and urgent, "or I will use this." The words should have calmed Leonard. They clarified the threat. Instead, they hardened everything: his breath, his muscles, his understanding. Because threats were honest in a way, smiles were not. The passengers heard it, too. Phones tilted higher. The aisle seemed to contract, pulling everyone closer to the line that had been drawn. Somewhere, a luggage bin clicked. Somewhere, a curtain swished. Somewhere, a boy asked his father if they were safe and got an answer that did not convince even the man who gave it. Leonard did not blink. He let the silence stretch just long enough to feel the plane's bones thrumming through the soles of his shoes. He knew there would be no persuading this man. He knew there would be no help from anyone in a uniform that matched. He knew, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that the next choice would shape everything that came after. And then he spoke. Not loud, not theatrical, simply certain. "If you touch anyone with that," he said, "you will answer to me." The second attendant's gaze flicked past Leonard to the scattered glass, to the trapped man, to the cameras watching. A muscle jumped along his cheek. He took that final half-step forward, commitment settling across his shoulders like a coat. The cabin exhaled in one long, trembling breath. Leonard set his feet. Edwin drew the child closer and hunched as a shield. The older man leveled his cane. Victor dug his heels against the floor and prepared to buck. The syringe caught the light, bright and cold. Every shadow now carried a hidden weapon. Harold lunged with the syringe already aimed, his shoes sliding on the narrow aisle as the plane shuddered around him, and Leonard cut to the side in one swift, practiced step. Metal armrests caught Harold at the hip, turning his thrust into a glancing jab that hissed past Leonard's ribs and sank into the cushion with a dull pop. "Stand down," Harold growled through clenched teeth, voice low and hard, his eyes never leaving Leonard's face. The cabin lights flickered from a pocket of turbulence, and the faint hum of engines seemed to tighten, pulling every sound into a tense, shrinking circle. Leonard felt the edge of breath return to his chest, then pushed off the seat back with one hand, the other hand sweeping for anything he could use. His fingers brushed cold metal, Victor's dropped blade, half hidden beneath a flight magazine, and he lifted it with a steadiness that surprised even him. Harold saw the blade and smirked, but the smirk never reached his eyes. "You think that saves you?" he asked, breath quick and sharp, the syringe still steady in his other hand. His shoulders were squared, yet the point of the needle trembled like a single raindrop about to fall. Leonard read that tremor the way he read a hostile boardroom. The performance was strong, the foundation thin. Behind Leonard, Edwin held Noah close and shifted toward the bulkhead, voice barely above a whisper as he said, "We're with you." The older man with the cane gripped the headrest in front of him, knuckles pale as if he might rise and then thought better of it. All around, men pressed against their seats, eyes wide, breath held, the air thick with fear and the start of courage. Leonard lifted the blade, palm open, not waving it, but letting it exist as a line of warning. "Put the needle down," he said, keeping his tone even. "Or face me without it." The challenge landed like a spark. Harold's jaw fired tight with offense, yet the needle's point quivered. He tried to bury the slip by squaring his stance and lowering his center of gravity. "You hide behind speeches," he said, drawing closer, his shoes whispering over the carpet. "I make problems disappear." Leonard heard the word disappear and felt a low heat climb his spine. He stepped into the narrow space where both men had to commit. "What is it?" he asked, nodding at the syringe. "Sedative? Pain? Or something to shut a voice?" The question was a trap and an invitation at once, and Harold sensed it. His gaze flicked for the smallest fraction down to the syringe barrel as if checking a label he knew by heart. That tiny glance gave Leonard a first move. He angled his shoulders to crowd Harold's reach, blade held low, not to slash but to control distance, forcing Harold to lean farther to land a strike. Metal creaked as the cart behind them rattled. Victor, on the carpet, shifted and groaned, one arm cradling his wrist, his face a mask of shock cut through with pride. "Do it, Harold," Victor rasped, voice sticky with pain. "End it." For a beat, Harold seemed pulled by the command as if the word end was a chain on his collar. The needle rose a fraction. Leonard's voice sliced in, calm and cold. "You hide behind needles because you can't face men." The sentence broke the air. Several passengers hissed in surprise. One man in an aisle seat said, "Enough," before fear swallowed his voice again. Harold's cheeks flushed. He drove forward with a sudden, angry step, more speed than control, and that was all the opening Leonard needed. Leonard pivoted on the ball of his foot, letting Harold's momentum pass, blade coming up as a guard to ward away the syringe hand. The two bodies scraped close, jacket to jacket, and the metal kiss of blade to barrel rang like a tiny bell. For a heartbeat, they were locked, each man's breath a hard push against the other's chest. Leonard saw sweat beating at Harold's temple. Harold saw the steady, flat calm in Leonard's eyes and flinched, not backward but inward, as if something old and private had been uncovered. Behind them, Edwin's voice slid through the tight space. "Leonard." It was not a warning so much as a heartbeat, a reminder that he was not alone. Leonard shifted his weight, testing Harold's balance, and realized the attendant was stronger in the shoulders, weaker at the hips, stable on polished floors, clumsy in a shaking aisle. He planted his heel, ready to drive, when the plane bucked. The turbulence hit like a low, rolling fist. Overhead, bins trembled. Seatbelt signs chimed with a dull ping. A suitcase thudded softly inside a compartment. Harold's knee knocked a magazine pocket. Leonard's shoulder clipped a headrest. Both men tumbled half a step sideways, then tried to recover at once. The syringe snapped free from the cushion with a sticky sound, and Harold's fingers, slick with sweat, lost their perfect pinch on the barrel. Leonard raised his blade to parry a desperate jab that never came. Instead, the needle skittered, kissed the aisle carpet, and began to slide. In that instant, Harold's eyes widened and darted after it. The cool poise ripped away to reveal fear. "No," he said under his breath, the word flat with panic. The needle slid under a seat, then out again, rolling toward the coach boundary like a silver fish gliding in a shallow stream. Not far behind, Victor dragged himself on an elbow, reaching, but pain seized his face and pinned him in place. Leonard lunged to block Harold's line. No strike, only presence, body agate between the man and the tool. "Back," Leonard said, breath heaving, blade still low, "or you answer for what you've done without anything to hide behind." Harold's chest rose and fell too fast now. The thin edge of his calm had frayed to threads. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said, giving the words a brittle authority. "No idea who protects us." It was a threat, and yet it sounded more like a plea to restore the old order of fear. The aisle narrowed with bodies leaning, watching, recording with trembling hands held at the edge of their courage. The cabin lights steadied, and in that steadiness the scene sharpened. Harold's heaving chest, Leonard's planted feet, Edwin's hand cradling Noah while his eyes darted between brother and needle. A man, 2 rows back, murmured, "Don't touch it," as if warning himself more than anyone else. The older man with the cane slid the wood tip into the aisle, not quite stepping in, but marking a line like a quiet boundary stone. Leonard felt the moment change. Control was no longer something Harold could declare. It was something the cabin itself would decide. Harold feinted left, then cut right, reaching for the syringe with a short, stabbing grab. Leonard moved with him, not to strike but to take the space, shoulder checking him into an armrest. The sound of Harold's breath leaving him was the sound of a plan denting. The syringe rolled farther, tapped a sneaker, and settled against a row of laces. A boy, 15 by the looks of him, a narrow face gone pale with adrenaline, looked down, eyes wide as mirrors. For a second he didn't move, as if the thing at his feet were a live wire. Harold saw him, and the mask of composure cracked into raw order. "Kick it here!" Harold snapped, hand out, command sharpened by urgency. The boy didn't kick. His fingers moved instead, slow and careful as if he were lifting a fragile bird. He bent, pinched the barrel between thumb and forefinger, and stood. Everything paused. The engines still hummed. The air still hissed through the vents. Noah still whimpered softly against Edwin's chest. But the center of the cabin shifted to a pair of steady, shaking hands that now held a choice. The boy looked from the syringe to Leonard, then to Harold, and back to Leonard again. Leonard lowered the blade an inch and spoke so only the nearest rows could hear. "Hold it up," he said, his voice pitched to carry calm. "Don't point it at yourself. Don't put your finger near the tip. It's important." The boy swallowed, nodded, and raised it, hands high, arms straight. Harold took a half step, stopped, and the stop said more than any speech. Men along the aisle leaned forward, phones lifted, eyes recording as surely as lenses. Leonard felt the weight of time settle on his shoulders, a sense that the future had leaned into the present to watch. He knew this moment would either open the door to truth or close it with a lock that would not be broken later. He did not look at Harold again. He looked at the boy. "You're safe," Leonard said, and he made the words a promise. "Stay with us. We'll protect you." The boy's breath shivered once, then steadied. Somewhere near the galley, Victor let out a small, helpless laugh that tried to sound like control and failed. Harold's lips moved without sound, his eyes calculating routes that no longer existed. In the quiet, a new shape of courage formed, simple and bright. Leonard did not raise the blade higher. He did not lunge. He simply held the space, turned his body to shield the boy with his shoulder while keeping Harold in his sight line. Edwin shifted, aligning his own stance to close a seam in their defense. The older man with the cane slid it farther into the aisle until the polished wood touched Leonard's shoe, a silent, stubborn link in a growing chain. The plane thumped once more as it passed through a ragged pocket of air, but no one toppled. The line held. Harold looked smaller now, not because he had shrunk, but because the room no longer bent around him. A murmur passed down the rows like a slow wave, and the phones tilted to capture the boy's raised hands, the silver barrel gleaming under the cabin lights. Leonard breathed in the dry scent of recycled air and metal. and he felt the story change key. When Harold spoke next, his voice was careful, almost gentle, like a man coaxing a skittish animal. "Listen," he said to the boy, curling his fingers in a beckon. "You don't want to get involved. Pass that to me, and this ends." His smile was thin and strained. "You'll go home, son. No trouble." The boy's gaze did not shift. He stared at Leonard as if the truth were a rope, and Leonard was the only hand holding it steady. Leonard let himself see the boy's fear, and the bravery pressed inside it. He nodded once. "You did the right thing," he said, voice low and plain. "Keep it up." "Don't move unless I tell you." He watched Harold's hands, not his face. Those hands twitched, left thumb flexing, right finger tapping, signs of a man seeking a new plan and finding none. Harold drew in a long breath and held it, chest lifted, a last effort to rebuild a mask that had fallen to pieces at his feet. It was too late. The cabin had witnessed the crack and would remember it. Somewhere in the rows behind, a seatbelt clicked open. Somewhere ahead, a man cleared his throat and then went still, as if preparing for an announcement that would not come. Leonard looked from the boy to Edwin, then to Harold. His voice, when it came, was quiet but clear enough to fill the aisle. "This ends differently now." The truth of that sentence lived in every posture around him, upright, alert, unblinking. Harold's mouth flattened, the color high in his cheeks, and he took one last step forward, the kind of step a man takes on a bridge he knows is broken. He didn't get close. Leonard eased a shoulder into his path, and the older man moved the cane an inch to the left, and Edwin shifted his weight into a square, balanced stance. The boy did not flinch, did not drop his arms, did not look away from the man who had promised to keep him safe. The hum of the engine seemed to grow quieter in respect. Even Victor's labored breath faded under the weight of a moment that belonged to someone else now, someone smaller and steadier than the men who had started the fight. And then, in that hush, as if naming the turn so that it could not be denied, Leonard found the words that fit the shape of the scene and let them fall into the waiting air. The weapon meant for silence had just found a witness. He thought silencing a black CEO's baby mid-flight would go unanswered. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Harold lunged for the boy with the syringe and never made it. Leonard intercepted hard, driving him backward with a forearm across the chest and slamming him into the overhead bins. Plastic latches rattled. A suitcase shifted and thudded against its frame. The boy stumbled away down the aisle, clutching the syringe with both hands, knuckles white, breath coming in fast bursts. "Keep moving," Edwin called, voice shaking but firm, one arm sheltering Noah and the other guiding the teenager past a row of men who were finally lifting their heads. The plane's lights flickered with a soft tremor. Somewhere in the fuselage a panel buzzed. The air felt thin and hot. Leonard followed with controlled steps, planting his knee on Harold's sternum before the attendant could wriggle free. "Stay down," Leonard said, the words level, almost quiet, like a boardroom decision delivered without ceremony. Harold hissed a laugh through clenched teeth and tried to twist his wrist free. Leonard trapped the arm, palm pinning it to the stained carpet. Eyes narrowed not with rage but calculation. He could feel Harold's ribs rise and fall under his weight, could hear the rush of engine noise pressing against the cabin like a second, constant heartbeat. A few rows back, Victor's groan scraped along the aisle. "You've ruined yourself," Victor whispered, voice ragged, the kind of hiss that sought corners and shadows. He lay, half-curled, hand to his wrist, blood smearing the cuff of his sleeve. "There will be consequences." "There will be." He paused, breath hitching as a passenger lifted a phone, the screen glowing blue. Victor smirked out of habit, not understanding that the light on his face was also a spotlight on his words. He lowered his voice to a threat meant for one man and instead spoke into a dozen open microphones. "Stand up," Edwin called to the passengers, not shouting, not begging, inviting. "Protect your family. Stay together." His posture was awkward with Noah in his arms, but his eyes were steady, scanning faces, anchoring panic with simple instructions. A man with a cane gripped the armrest, then rose, shoulders hunched but resolve visible in the set of his jaw. A college-age man exchanged a glance with him and stood too. One by one, the frozen silence that had filled the rows cracked. Seatbelts unclicked. Heads turned forward instead of down. The fear in the cabin didn't vanish. It rearranged itself into a watchful line. Harold wrenched once more beneath Leonard's knee. "You think you're brave," he spat, sweat slicking his temples. "You're just loud." His gaze flicked past Leonard toward the boy, who had edged into the space near the bulkhead, shielding the syringe against his chest like a fragile relic. Leonard read the glance and shifted his weight, blocking Harold's sightline, forcing his focus back. "Look at me," Leonard said, tone dropping a note. He wasn't taunting, he was testing. "Who gave the order?" Harold's mouth twitched, a flash of uncertainty behind bluster. He opened it to answer, or to lie, but never had the chance. The cockpit door latch clicked. It was a small sound, barely louder than the rustle of a magazine, but it ran a wire through every spine. The door cracked open. A line of cold brightness slashed the darker cabin, and Captain Moreland Cale stepped out. He was taller than Leonard expected up close, uniform pressed immaculate even in turbulence, expression composed to the point of emptiness. The pilot's presence was supposed to be an anchor, the last assurance that logic would outlast fear. Yet his eyes, flat and measuring, moved first to Harold pinned to the carpet, then to Victor, then to the boy with the syringe, and only last to Leonard. The order of his attention said as much as any speech. "Captain," Leonard said. He rose from his knee without surrendering ground, posture open, palms visible, blade nowhere in sight. He took one step to place himself between the pilot and the boy. He did not beg, and he did not accuse. The calm in his voice was the calm he used when entire balance sheets tilted on a single decision. "Your crew assaulted a child. You need to see this. We need to secure the evidence," and Land Cale did not look at the evidence. He looked at Leonard's face as if reading a report for flaws. "You're inflaming the cabin," the pilot said, tone even, a manager in a crisis meeting who had decided on a narrative already. His gaze slid past Leonard to the other men now standing in the aisle. "Everyone return to your seats." Now the order was not shouted. It didn't need to be. Authority has a way of wearing velvet while holding steel. The teenager with the syringe swallowed. "Sir, they tried to—" He cut himself off when Edwin raised a hand, small motion, calm. Edwin's expression told the boy what words could not. "Hold your ground, but do not draw the first line." Victor shifted, voice oily again, seeking the new center of power. "Captain," he said, "this man attacked crew. He is dangerous. He has turned the cabin against order. Protocol. Protocol requires truth," Leonard said, eyes still on Kyle. The engines throbbed. Somewhere near row 20, a baby, someone else's son, whimpered, then quieted, as if sensing the entire aircraft holding its breath. Leonard studied the pilot's unmarked face and felt a warning stir, a soft, relentless thought. He's not surprised. It was not proof, not yet, but it was a pattern he had learned to trust over years of building and defending a company. When a man expects a storm, he does not flinch at lightning. Cale's jaw moved once, a controlled clench. "We will restore order," he said. "We have procedures for events like this." The last 4 words were quiet, almost gentle, and they were the most telling. Events like this. Not an anomaly. A category. Leonard stepped closer, half a pace, nothing sudden. He felt Edwin's attention at his back like a steady hand. "Order does not mean silence," Leonard said. "It means safety. It means landing with the truth intact." Harold laughed from the floor, a rough edge of sound. "Truth," he said, rolling the word like a pebble between his teeth. "Truth is whatever the world hears first." Phones rose higher in answer, lenses reflecting the overhead lights, and for a heartbeat the aisle was a corridor of small, stubborn stars. Dramatic irony tightened like a knot. Victor's pride made him reckless, and the more he spoke, the more he insured himself against escape. He didn't see it. Cale did. The pilot's gaze caught the glassy glow and stayed there for half a second too long. "Sir," the teenager said to Cale, voice trembling but steadying, "I have the syringe." I saw him try to use it. His hands shook as he held the object up just enough for the pilot to see the needle's glint, not enough to expose it to a lunge. He stood like a witness at a threshold. His eyes were older than they had been 5 minutes ago. Cale's expression did not change. He took another step into the aisle. The cabin seemed to narrow around him. "Place that on the floor," he said. "And you," he added to Leonard, "step aside." "Captain," Leonard replied, and now the quiet in his voice was harder. "The men who caused this are on the ground. They are not flying this aircraft. You are." He drew a breath, sensed the cabin's weight tilt toward the next second. What you do now will define what happens when we land." It was not a threat. It was a ledger line. Kyle considered him the way one executive measures another at the far end of a deal. No anger, only calculation. He had the eyes of a man who knew how to make a decision look like a policy. The hum of the engines thickened underfoot as if the plane were leaning toward Earth somewhere beyond the sealed windows. Leonard felt sweat slide down his spine. He did not wipe it away. In the row beside them, the man with the cane shifted, placing the cane tip in the aisle like a boundary marker. His voice was quiet. "We saw what happened," he said to no one in particular and to everyone at once. "We're not sitting down." Courage, when it spreads, does not shout. It anchors. Cale's mouth moved as if he would answer that, or dismiss it. Then his eyes returned to the syringe. His shoulders squared. His right hand hovered near the collar of his uniform where a clipped microphone rested, where a single button could turn one message into many. Leonard saw the motion and felt the future lean. He thought of the boy's narrow chest rising and falling, of Edwin's hands, tense but sure, of Noah's small weight, pulse against pulse. He thought of the line between control and care, and which side of it men choose when no one is watching, or when everyone is. "Captain," Leonard said, one last time, one last offer. Cale inhaled. He did not accept the offer. He did not ask a question. He gave an answer that fit neatly into a policy binder, smooth on the surface and sharp underneath. His voice came out cool, patterned by long practice, filling the aisle without needing to rise. Control must be restored. At any cost, Leonard's heart dropped. The rot wasn't limited to the attendants. It reached the very top of this flight. The man trusted to guide them safely was guiding them into betrayal. Leonard did not lower the blade. He held it chest high, the metal steady in the air as the cabin lights buzzed and the engines hummed like distant thunder beneath everyone's feet. Captain Cale stood in the aisle with his shoulders squared and his jaw tight, the gold bars on his epaulets catching the glow in hard, unforgiving lines. "Stand down," the captain said, each syllable clipped and cold, his eyes moving past Leonard to measure the passengers like a problem to be fixed rather than people to be protected. The cabin air felt thin. Somewhere a ventilation fan clicked. No one breathed loudly enough to be heard. Edwin rose first, voice shaking with anger and fear that only made him louder. "You're protecting men who hurt children," he shouted, gripping the seat back until his knuckles blanched. His words cut through the stale quiet like a crack in glass. Heads turned. A father held his sleeping son closer, eyes widening. A businessman pulled his hands away from his laptop, shame flushing his face as he finally looked up. The older man with the cane pushed himself to standing, breath shallow but determined. He lifted the cane as though raising a banner. No one cheered, but a current moved through the rows, the silent electricity of people deciding to stop looking away. Cale's gaze snapped to Edwin with an impatient flick, then back to Leonard, as if the others were stray noise. "I said, stand down," he repeated, voice deeper now, the cadence of someone used to being obeyed. His hands were empty, but the calm in his posture was its own kind of weapon. "This aircraft will divert to a secure facility." "You will answer for endangering crew." Leonard's chest rose and fell, slow and deliberate. He tasted metal, blood somewhere inside his mouth, and kept the blade exactly where it was. He did not advance. He did not retreat. He let the silence hang, then filled it. "No," he said, not loud, but strong enough that the words seemed to settle over the aisle like a lock sliding into place. "This is no longer your plane. It's ours." His voice did not waver. The words moved like a tide through the cabin, washing behind him, leaving a line in the sand. A murmur unfurled from seat to seat, hesitant, then firm. The older man angled his cane forward and nodded once, as if swearing a quiet oath. Two teenagers stood beside him, exchanging a glance that said they were tired of being afraid. A man in a gray jacket rose, swallowed hard, and said, "We saw what happened." Another whispered, "We have it recorded," and his phone trembled in his hand. Courage in the cabin was fragile but real, like thin glass warmed by sunlight. Kyle's nostrils flared. He did not shout. He did not need to. "You are making a grave mistake." He lifted one hand to chest level, palm out in a restrained regulatory gesture, the pose of a person who controlled procedures and, by believing in them, thought he controlled outcomes. "Order must be maintained." "Sit down." He spoke to everyone and to no one. The language of announcements and reports, a tone designed to flatten human edges into policy. Leonard recognized that tone. He had heard it in boardrooms when men pretended that cruelty was a system and not a choice. His fingers tightened on the hilt until his tendons ached. He imagined the blade as a pointer he could use to draw a bright line between what had been allowed and what would never be allowed again. He took a measured breath, then lowered the tip just slightly, not surrender, but intention, so the steel no longer threatened the captain's chest but marked the space between them. "You lost the right to command when you abandoned the duty to protect," he said, voice low. "We will land. We will answer questions, but you will not rewrite what happened here." Dramatic irony thickened like fog. Cale looked like stability in a world of motion, yet the passengers had watched him step out of the cockpit not to protect them, but to reassert control over them. They had seen his first instinct: preserve authority, not safety. The uniform that was supposed to promise refuge had become a wall, and from seats across the cabin, the light from half-raised phones gleamed like small lighthouses refusing to be shut off. Edwin edged closer to Leonard, careful of the narrow aisle, one arm around the infant pressed against his chest, the other steadying himself on the seatbacks. "We have people," he whispered, his eyes flicking to the pockets of passengers who were standing now, to the man in gray, to the teenagers, to the older man with the cane. "Not enough to fight a war, but enough to hold a line." "Then we hold it," Leonard said without looking away from Cale. The captain's jaw worked. He lifted his chin, and when he spoke again his voice softened into the persuasive cadence of training videos and safety briefings. "Everyone, please be seated. There is no need for alarm. We will resolve this as soon as we can." The phrasing was smooth. The effect was chilling. It reached for obedience, the kind learned from years of trusting announcements more than instincts. A baby whimpered somewhere to the right. A tray rattled as a nervous hand set down a paper cup. The plane banked a degree and leveled. The engines droned on. In that mechanical steadiness, Leonard heard the trap, calm as camouflage, routine as a rope. He saw the route the captain would choose, procedure that would look rightful while it buried truth. Cale's eyes, unreadable shades of iron, slid toward the forward bulkhead. The intercom handset was mounted there like a lever that could tilt the whole world. He took a half-step sideways, casual in a way that drew attention precisely because it tried not to. The passengers nearest the front watched that step with held breath. One of the teenagers whispered, "He's going to say something," and the other shook his head, unsure whether to move or to brace. Leonard saw it as well, the small intention shaping into action. He understood what a broadcast could do: convert a struggle for safety into a claim of mutiny, turn witnesses into suspects, turn cries for help into noise. He pictured the words spoken in that calm, official tone and transmitted beyond the cabin, received by men in uniforms who would arrive already convinced of who was dangerous and who was not. He thought of how quickly a story could be rewritten once the first line was declared from a position of power. And yet, he also knew that lunging now, blade first, would hand that same story its perfect opening. He could not strike. He could not stand idle. He had to hold the narrow path between violence and surrender. He lowered the blade further until it hovered at his thigh and raised his free hand, fingers open, a human shape formed into a visible restraint. "Captain," he said calmly, "don't." He placed all the weight of the moment into the single word, plea and warning fused together. "Look at them." He nodded behind him without turning. The older man, the teenagers, the man in gray, the others who had stood because someone had to. "Look at what they are doing. They are not attacking you. They are refusing to be afraid." Cale's gaze flicked, quick and measuring, and then returned like a boomerang to the thing he could still control: the process, the script, the device that turned one voice into law. "I will restore order," he said, eyes clearing to a frosted blue stillness, "for everyone's sake." The older man lifted his cane another inch. His voice, when it came, was thin but firm. "If you lie about us," he said, "you will not be believed." Not this time. The statement did not sound like bravado. It sounded like a promise carried on tired lungs. A young man in the mid-cabin set his phone higher, the camera's tiny eye unblinking. "We're recording," he said, and the phone trembled less than it had a minute before. For a heartbeat, it seemed as if the captain might stop. The muscles along his neck loosened, and the stern set of his mouth softened, an afterimage of the person he could have been in a different choice. Then a new calculation cut through his features. His shoulders squared again. He angled his body toward the panel. Leonard's hand tightened around the hilt. He felt the point where his options thinned to a wire. The blade did not rise. His voice did. "You will make this worse," he said. "You will make this dangerous." It was not an argument, it was a forecast, given like weather. He hoped the truth, plainly spoken, might reach whatever part of Cale still listened to consequences. Cale did not answer. He shifted his stance one more inch toward the handset, the way a man steps toward a cliff he has convinced himself is a bridge. The silence broke not with a shout, but with the scrape of leather as he moved. All eyes followed that sound. The cabin seemed to lean with him. The captain's fingers lifted, precise and calm, and extended toward the intercom cradle. His expression became a mask of practiced neutrality, the look of a man who had repeated the same phrases so often that he believed they could turn any chaos into order. The handset sat in its bracket like a loaded sentence waiting to be spoken. For an instant, the whole aircraft felt suspended between one story and another. Leonard did not blink. Edwin did not breathe. The passengers did not sit. The phones did not lower. The hand kept reaching, steady as a pendulum swinging toward the hour that would strike and change the shape of everything. And as it neared the plastic curve, the thought that moved through the aisle was not a scream, but a sober, inevitable line, the kind a person understands a beat before it is said aloud. If unity was their strength, the pilot was ready to turn it into their downfall. The intercom crackled, sharp as a tear in cloth, and Captain Moreland Cale's voice filled the cabin with a clipped authority that seemed to drain the air. "Ladies and gentlemen, remain seated. Violent passengers have attacked our crew. Security will meet us upon landing." The words dropped like stones. Heads turned, shoulders tightened. The silence that followed was not calm. It was the fearful quiet of people bracing for something they could not see. Leonard Voss stood very still, his chest rising and falling as if he were holding a door shut against a storm. He knew the message was a lie, and he knew why it had been told. This was not only about a child's cry or a cut inflicted in cruelty, it was about burying the truth before it reached the ground. He leaned close to Edwin, his voice low but urgent. "We need those phones protected. That's our weapon." Edwin's face, pale with rage and worry, tightened with resolve. He nodded once, then moved with deliberate calm through the nearest row, guiding trembling passengers to cluster around the teenager gripping the syringe like proof carved from air. Edwin's hands were gentle on shoulders, firm at elbows, his words steady. "Form a circle. Keep your cameras up. Do not engage. Just record." The passengers shifted, hesitant at first, then with growing purpose. A businessman pressed his phone to his chest as if it were a last photograph of home. A college kid swallowed hard and raised his recording higher, his throat bobbing like he had learned a new way to breathe. Leonard's gaze tracked everything. The faint buzz of ceiling lights, the metallic clink of the service cart settling into place, the way Victor Redden, bleeding at the wrist, grinned through the pain as if the blood itself were proof of victory. Victor's voice slithered across the aisle. "You'll lose everything the moment we touch ground," he hissed, his mouth curving in a cold smile. "Power listens to uniforms, not to passengers with stories." Leonard didn't answer right away. He listened to the plane instead, the soft cry of a man praying under his breath, the hush of a baby's tired whimper, the rattling hum that ran through the fuselage like a warning that metal could remember. Across the aisle, Harold Trenn shifted his weight, eyes scanning for gaps in the makeshift shield around the boy. His chin lifted, his hand flexed. He was weighing distance like a runner before a bell. Leonard saw it and stepped a fraction to the left, placing himself in the narrow lane that Harold would need. "Don't," Leonard said, not loud, not soft, just certain. Harold paused, calculation replacing anger, the muscles at his jaw twitching like a wire pulled too tight. The intercom clicked again, a breath taken by a machine. Cale's tone returned, smoother now, as if the mask had been polished. "Remain calm. Any further aggression will force emergency procedures." The phrase landed with a chill that traced every spine. Emergency procedures. Leonard pictured sealed doors, manipulated pressure, lights cut at the wrong instant. He saw the threat for what it was. Not chaos, but control used as a blade. He felt the old boardroom instinct rise, anticipate, absorb, redirect. He needed space, not only to act, but to be seen acting. Truth had to be visible, not just spoken. "Edwin," Leonard said, eyes still on Harold, "shift the line to the right." Give them a clear sight line, Edwin understood. He shepherded the passengers 2 steps over, creating a narrow corridor down the center aisle. Phones lifted in a small wave. The boy with the syringe stayed pressed between 2 men who stood shoulder to shoulder like a doorway that had decided to be a wall. The circle held. The circle breathed. Victor laughed softly, the sound unpleasantly bright. "Nice formation," he said, eyes glinting. "You play soldier now?" He winced as he tried to roll his injured wrist. His voice dropped to a whisper meant to sting. "You can't carry this off the plane. We'll say you threatened us. We'll say you forced it. Who will they believe?" The cabin lights flickered once, then settled. Leonard glanced up, reading the blink like a weather sign. A foreshadowing moved in him, the sense that someone in the cockpit was preparing a lever, something technical to make fear feel official. He had to answer, not for Victor, but for the people watching with scared, hopeful faces. "We won't let your story be the only story," Leonard said, his tone even, his posture open. "Everything is being recorded. If we stand together, your lies do not scale." His words disturbed the air with a new rhythm, less panic, more purpose. A man in the 4th row, jaw clenched, lifted his phone higher. Another, old and weary, steadied his hand on the armrest and set his camera squarely on Victor's face. Reality, framed and stored. Harold tested the aisle again, one shoe smoothing the carpet in a step that looked casual until one noticed his shoulder change angle by a degree. Leonard's weight shifted forward before Harold fully moved, a small pivot that said, "You will meet me first." Their eyes locked. Harold tried to smile, but it faltered at the edges. He had leaned on threat for so long that he could not find a clean step without it. Cale's voice returned, more commanding. "All passengers, sit down now." The command crossed the cabin like a draft through a closed house. Some bodies began to fold from habit. Edwin raised both hands, palms out, and spoke quickly, "Stay where you are." Film. That's all he looked to Leonard, and for a beat the 2 brothers were boys again in a rough neighborhood, reading the street before they walked it. Leonard gave a small nod. Hold the ground, hold the story. The plane shuddered gently, a pocket of air appearing like a small trap beneath them. People gasped, phones dipped, a few knuckles went white. Leonard felt the tremor as a finger on a chess clock. Someone up front was timing people's fear. He stepped into that fear with purpose. "Listen to me," he said, voice carrying without a shout. "Do not run, do not argue, and do not touch them. They want a spark they can call a fire. Give them nothing but truth." He pointed to the phones, to the boy's tight grip on the syringe. "This is our record. Stay steady." Victor's grin thinned. He rolled his shoulder against the bulkhead, measuring how far he could edge toward the galley without obviously moving. "Your calm won't matter when doors open," he muttered. "Bad stories travel faster than good ones." Leonard heard the sentence and stored it the way a builder taps a beam and counts the echo. It was not insight. It was habit. Habits could be broken. A father in row 7 took a careful step, placing himself half a pace in front of the teenager with the syringe. He did not speak. He only looked at Leonard and gave the smallest nod a man could give and still be seen. Something quiet moved through the group then, men aligning their feet, widening their stance, remembering that standing could be an action too. The aisle felt narrower, safer, like a passage guarded by intention. Cale's voice pressed down again. "Final warning. Sit down." The cabin lights buzzed, just once. Leonard thought of switches on a panel, of how small a button looked before it changed a room. He breathed in, set his shoulders, and committed to the line he had already chosen. If the crew wanted a story of violence to carry off this plane, they would not find it in the passengers. If the crew wanted silence, they would not get that either. He lifted his chin and stepped forward, bringing himself cleanly into every frame that pointed his way. Victor's eyes narrowed. Harold's hands opened and closed as if trying to hold wind. Edwin's voice, steady and low, moved along the circle. "Just film. Just film." Leonard did not look at the cameras, but he spoke to them as much as to the men facing him. "No more threats," he said. "No more tricks." The blade in his hand caught a dull stripe of light, not a threat brandished, but a boundary drawn. He could feel the passengers behind him, a living wall, choosing to hold, choosing not to break. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then, from the floor where he leaned, Victor tried one more needle of a sentence. "You still think you decide how this ends?" His smile tried to bloom and failed. Leonard turned his head enough to meet the man's gaze and, with a voice as calm as a door closing on a storm, answered the question and the fear beneath it. "Then we won't wait for the ground." The words reached every row and rang in every speaker, clear and undeniable. A stunned silence followed as the passengers understood his meaning, that the end of this battle would not be written for them by uniforms or announcements, but chosen, right now, by their courage. The line behind him steadied. The phones did not waver. Resolve moved across the cabin like a tide turning. Cale's intercom stayed open, the soft static a backdrop to breathing. The plane held its course. Leonard centered his stance, blade low, eyes level, and readied himself for whatever the crew tried next. The moment did not explode. It thickened, refusing to be pushed forward by lies or pulled backward by fear. In that held second, the shape of the next act became clear. Not surrender, not noise, but an action visible to every lens and impossible to rewrite. He could feel the future press against the present, a promise and a warning at once. He did not blink. He did not step back. He spoke once more, not to sway the men before him, but to fix the truth in place so it could not be moved. Justice would not land later. It would rise here, among the clouds. Leonard moved first. The blade in his hand cut a clean line through the air as Captain Cale's fingers hovered over the cockpit control panel, his knuckles white with authority. A hiss of breath escaped the pilot as Leonard's strike landed across the back of his hand, sharp enough to stop the motion, precise enough to spare the arteries. The button that would have dropped the cabin into terror remained unpressed. Metal glinted. Blood beaded. The cabin drew a single collective breath that hung trembling above the seats. Kyle staggered 2 steps, clutching his hand to his chest. His shoulders, squared by years of command, folded for a heartbeat before pride forced them back into place. "Stand down," he growled, voice low and clipped, the kind of voice that had ended arguments for decades. But the sound trembled at the edges. Leonard saw it. Everyone saw it. The uniform still fit, but certainty no longer did. Victor, pressed under Leonard's boot, writhed and hissed, "You're finished," through clenched teeth, though his eyes flicked nervously toward the pilot's wounded hand. Harold tried to push up from the aisle, breath ragged, one palm flattened on the seatback for leverage. Edwin stood firm a few rows away, Noah cradled against his chest, the boy with the syringe angled behind him like a shadow with purpose. The passengers, fathers, sons, strangers, stared across the narrow aisle as if it were a cliff edge. None of them moved. None of them blinked. The engine hum became a drumbeat under the moment, steady and inevitable. The overhead bins vibrated gently, plastic lids chattering as if they were teeth. Leonard did not raise the blade again. He pointed it. That was enough. "No one touches that panel," he said, calm and clear. His chest rose and fell with the measured discipline of a man who had trained himself to breathe in boardrooms while empires shifted under his feet. Now the boardroom was aluminum skin and recycled air, and his empire was his son's safety. Captain Cale drew himself taller. The lines around his eyes deepened, not with age but with calculation. "You've endangered this flight," he said, working to steady his voice. "You think you're protecting them, but you're making it worse." He angled his body just enough to put his uninjured hand between Leonard and the recessed panel. His gaze slid past Leonard to the passengers, the way a captain surveys weather on the horizon. "Listen to me," he told them. "We need order." "Order?" the older man with the cane said, rising with effort. His words came out thin but unwavering. Order would have been stopping the first cut. He lowered the cane tip to the carpet like a slow gavel. Heads turned. Courage, small and shivering, began to stand. Harold found his breath. "Sit down," he snapped at the rows, trying to reclaim a script that had worked 1,000 times. The command hit the air and fell like a dull coin, sound without value. The boy with the syringe tightened his grip and looked to Edwin. Edwin nodded once, hardly a movement, but enough to anchor the boy where he stood. Leonard felt the cabin like a living thing, its temperature, its fear, its fragile turn toward resolve. He knew this pivot. He had seen it in merger rooms when the deal was about to tip. A man with power would try one more angle, one more quiet threat that sounded like reason. Cale would do the same. Leonard shifted his stance, blade hand low, boot still firm on Victor's shoulder blade. Victor shuddered and went still. "Think," Cale said softly, as if they were alone. "If pressure drops, we lose control. People get hurt. Are you prepared to carry that?" His eyes searched Leonard's face for a crack, a seam he could widen. "Hand me the knife. We will resolve this safely." Leonard's jaw tightened. He saw the faint smear of red gathering along Cale's knuckles, saw the twitch of the pilot's thumb toward the side of the panel, not the center, the way someone reaches for a hidden option rather than the obvious one. He pictured a schematic he had once studied for fun, systems inside systems, redundancies like buried wires. Depressurization might not be a single button. It might be a sequence. That was the danger. Not what everyone saw, but what they did not. "You just reached for something you didn't announce," Leonard said. His words were quiet, but they carried. "No more hidden commands." Cale's eyes cooled. "You don't know what you don't know." "Try me." A tremor ran through the fuselage as the plane cut a ribbon of thinner air. Luggage thumped softly behind plastic doors. A passenger 2 rows back whispered, "Please," to no one in particular, and then, louder, "Please." The plea didn't ask Leonard to stop. It asked the moment to choose a side. Harold shifted again, and Leonard tracked him without turning his head, reading the angle of his shoulders, the coil of his calves. If Harold lunged, it would be low and fast. If Cale moved, it would be small, a fingertip drawing an invisible pattern near the controls. Leonard understood both kinds of motion because he had spent years reading men who lay and men who pounced. Edwin's voice cut through, a measured baritone that he usually saved for briefing rooms and late-night strategy calls. "Captain," he said, "there are recordings. If you press anything, if you do anything to endanger the cabin, you will answer for it." He did not raise his tone. He did not need to. He and Leonard had built entire divisions with sentences like that. Cale's gaze slid to Edwin, then to the boy, then back to Leonard. A calculation finished behind his eyes. He shifted his injured hand, feigning pain so he could face the panel fully. The motion was graceful, practiced. Leonard saw the trick inside the pity. The pilot's uninjured wrist turned half an inch. A fingertip approached a plastic seam that did not look like a button at all. Leonard stepped in, closing the distance, the blade a flashing line. The strike was not wild. It was a signed decision. Enough to carve away the motion, not enough to ruin the man. Steel kissed skin. Kyle's breath burst out in surprise and pain. The pilot reeled, shoulders striking the corner of a storage unit with a hollow knock. Gasps broke the cabin's thin silence. One man clamped a hand over his mouth. Another, near the wing, exhaled a shaky, "Yes," as if he had been underwater for too long and had finally found the surface. Harold froze, knees bent, muscles undecided. Leonard caught the panel with his free hand and slid it closed, the latch clicking like the final word in a debate. He kept the blade low, not for show, but for balance. "You will not touch that again," he said. "Not with your left hand, not with your right, not with a hidden switch." "We are done with tricks." Cale's stare hardened into something colder than anger. "You've crossed a line," he whispered. His breath came quick, not with exertion but with the shock of losing a tool he had believed was his by right. "So did you," Leonard said, and he felt the truth of it settle into the bones of the aircraft. He was not a passenger in this moment. He was a wall. Victor tried to buck under Leonard's boot, then thought better of it and lay flat, face turned to the aisle, lips moving in small, angry prayers to a god of loopholes and settlements. "You think this ends here," Victor muttered, voice muffled against the carpet. "It doesn't." No one answered him. The passengers' eyes were fixed on Leonard and the pilot, the axis around which the world tilted. The air felt warmer now, the vents pushing out breath that smelled faintly of metal and something sweet, like a plastic warmed by a lamp. It was not a pleasant smell. It was real. "Back away from the panel," Leonard said to Cale, "and keep your hands where everyone can see them." Cale obeyed a fraction. He took one step, then stopped, shoulders still angled toward the invisible power he believed in. He lifted his injured hand, palm out, a reluctant show of compliance. With his other hand, he smoothed his uniform front, a habit more than a necessity, a way to reassemble the image. "You will regret this," Cale said, and there was no volume in it, only ice. "You think you're winning. You're only making it louder." That, Leonard replied, letting the blade's tip settle toward the floor as a message rather than a threat, is the point. For a heartbeat, the cabin held the shape of an ending. The pilot breathing hard. The attendant stilled. The older man upright with his cane like a staff. Edwin, steady as a pillar, Noah curled against him, the boy with the syringe standing just behind and to the side, posture squared by a courage he had not expected to find. In that heartbeat, the future rearranged itself, and the aircraft seemed to listen for what came next. Cale's eyes twitched toward the recessed panel one last time. The motion was tiny, a habit of a man who could not imagine a world where his fingers did not make the rules. Leonard stepped closer until their shoulders almost touched and the pilot could see his own reflection in the clean face of the blade, small, distorted, afraid. Leonard bent his head so only Cale could hear, voice low enough to disappear into the engine hum, hard enough to leave a mark. "You wanted silence. I'll give you screams." Leonard slammed Cale into the galley counter, the jolt ringing through metal like a struck bell. Trays leapt from their slots and clattered to the floor. Cutlery skittered in bright arcs, a storm of steel against the narrow aisle. Cale's breath burst out in a ragged cry, his hat flipping away and spinning to a stop against the base of the coffee machine. The pilot's hands clawed at the edge of the counter for balance. Leonard did not give him time. He drove a forearm across Cale's chest and pressed forward, the pressure pinning fabric, bones, and breath to the cold surface. "Stand down," Cale gasped, the command more habit than conviction. His voice tried to sound official, but fear pulled the edges thin. "You're endangering. You endangered us the moment you chose silence," Leonard said. His words came slow, even, as if measured against a line only he could see. The muscles in his jaw were set, but his eyes were steady, watching for the twitch of a hand, the shift of a shoulder. He felt the cabin behind him, the air quivering with breath and whispers, the way a diver senses the current. He would not be dragged. From the aisle, Victor's voice rose, rough and strained. "Captain, stand tall," he called, but it sounded like a plea. The man tried to push up on an elbow, failed, and sank back with a hiss. Farther down, Harold crawled, one palm sliding across the carpet as he reached beneath a seat, hunting. The boy's sneakers squeaked as he took a small step back. Then, heart hammering, he lifted the syringe and, after a breath that made him sway, threw it toward Edwin. The device arced once under the cabin lights and landed in Edwin's waiting hands. Relief flashed over the assistant's face. He slipped the syringe into his inner pocket and placed his other hand over it, as if to steady his own racing pulse. Leonard's focus tightened. Cale tried to twist free. Leonard shifted with him, not brutal for its own sake, but precise, like a craftsman blocking a dangerous movement. "Look at them," Leonard said, his mouth close enough that Cale could feel the breath. "Look at the men you swore to bring home." The pilot's eyes flicked past Leonard's shoulder to the rows of faces. The passengers did not cheer. They did not speak. They watched, caught between horror and relief, the two emotions weaving a single taut rope across the aisle. Cale's voice thinned. "This is not how order is kept." He gathered himself to bark an order, to reach for rank the way a drowning man reaches for a rope. "All passengers." Leonard's elbow rose and pinned Cale again. "Order without honor is a mask," he said. "You wore it until it cracked." He heard the tremor in his own words and felt the reason for it. The image of Noah's small face, the blood that should never have touched it. The memory did not blind him now. It honed him. He would not let fury waste itself. Every move must have purpose. Every word must leave a mark. Metal rattled. The coffee machine, loosened by the impact, squealed as Cale's shoulder slid beneath it. Leonard released a fraction of pressure, just enough to let the pilot's knees find the floor, and then yanked him forward by the lapel so they were face to face. Cale's eyes were wet and sharp, a man accustomed to commanding from a sealed door now dragged into the aisle he had judged from afar. "Call them off," Leonard said, voice low. Kyle swallowed. "You do not set conditions here." "Then listen to mine." Leonard eased him sideways, letting the pilot's weight shift to the galley wall where escape angles narrowed. "No more lies on the intercom. No more threats. You will tell the truth, or you will say nothing at all." A spoon rang against the floor near Leonard's shoes. He glanced down and saw the scattered cutlery, blades and forks gleaming like small and eager witnesses. Cale followed his gaze and caught the same thought. The cabin was filled with eyes and metal and memory. His chest rose and fell quickly. From the carpet, Victor tried again. "Captain," he said, forcing a rasp into strength, "protocol. Depressurize the section." The word hissed through teeth and pain, and a few passengers flinched as if the idea alone could steal their breath. Harold froze mid-crawl, realizing the pilot was still a lever that could be pulled. "You heard him," Leonard said, not looking away from Cale. "That's what they wanted, isn't it?" A switch to do the harm for them. He watched Cale's pupils, the small flares when a man lies to himself. "Tell me you didn't plan it." Cale shook his head, a motion too quick to be believed. "I planned to finish a flight," he said, and tried to make the sentence sound clean. He straightened, testing Leonard's hold, and added louder, "Passengers, return to—" Leonard pushed him back, harder this time. The galley counter groaned. "Do not talk to them as if they are problems," he said. "They are the record." He heard movement to his right. 2 men from row 12 stepping into the aisle, not to fight, but to stand. Edwin shifted his stance, his body square, one hand on his pocket, the other steadying the boy by the shoulder. The aircraft hummed, a long metal throat clearing itself somewhere beyond the ceiling. It was a simple sound, the kind a person stops noticing after takeoff. Now it felt like a warning. Leonard glanced up, then at the small grill above the galley door, where the intercom speaker waited. He could not know if the captain had left it live. He could only act as if every word mattered. "You have a choice," Leonard told Cale. "Stand with truth or stand alone." It was not a threat. It was a sentence framed in wood and wire and weight. Cale's lips pressed together until the corners went white. "I am responsible for this aircraft," he said, picking up the words like fallen metals and pinning them back to his chest. "And you are assaulting a—" The sentence died when Leonard seized his wrist. The pilot's hand twitched toward the console panel mounted at the galley bulkhead, a hand shaped by training to reach for buttons without thinking. Leonard was already moving. The blade in his grip, a narrow piece of steel shaken loose from a food service drawer, flashed and kissed the back of Cale's knuckles. It was not a slashing frenzy. It was a line drawn across a reaching hand, the single stroke of a man who had decided where to carve the day. Cale cried out and jerked back. The sound cut through the cabin like a flare. Several men flinched in sympathy. The older gentleman with the cane took a half step into the aisle, gaze fixed on Kyle, as if seeing for the first time that authority, when stripped of polish, was only a body like any other. "You wanted to press that," Leonard said, eyes sliding to the small innocuous button whose purpose the pilot knew and the passengers feared. "You wanted the quiet that comes after panic." He lowered the blade but kept it ready. "No more buttons." Kyle's breath shuddered. He turned his face away, and in the reflection of the metal cabinet Leonard saw the pilot's mask fracture. The man stared at his hand, then at the people. He was calculating, but not how to win, how to survive in a room that no longer nodded when he spoke. A bare scraping sound behind them signaled Harold's choice. He lunged, not at Leonard, but at Edwin, angling to knock him off balance and pry loose the syringe. The boy startled and stumbled. Edwin pivoted, one hand still gripping his hidden pocket. Harold's fingers snagged fabric. For an instant, it hung in doubt. Then the older gentleman's cane swung down, clean, deliberate, and struck Harold's shin. The attendant buckled to both knees with a choked yelp. A second passenger moved, looping a belt across Harold's forearms, and another man tightened the strap with a quiet apology for the roughness. Leonard didn't turn. He trusted the motion, the small alliance forming without orders. His eyes stayed on Kyle. "Hear that?" he asked as Harold's breath came in tight gasps and Victor's mutters thinned into silence. "That is how men stand when they have been pushed too far." Kyle swallowed. He looked at the intercom panel. His gaze slipped almost unwillingly to the tiny green light tucked below the grill. It glowed. Leonard followed his eyes and felt his heartbeat change tempo. The line was open. Words had been traveling whether they intended them to or not. Cale saw Leonard see it. Panic flickered. He drew breath to reach for the switch, to hide what could still be hidden. Leonard's free hand snapped up and caught the pilot's wrist, not cutting this time, only holding, the grip like a door closed gently but firmly. "Leave it," Leonard said. Kyle stared at him in horror and then in dawning comprehension. "You don't know what that means," he whispered. "I know exactly what it means," Leonard replied. The thought swept through him like clean air. If the intercom had been live to the cockpit, then the aircraft's systems had been listening too. He did not need to know procedures to recognize the weight of recorded sound. The truth was no longer a thing to carry. It was already traveling. Victor tried once more, voice frayed thin. "Captain!" But the address held no power now. It hung and fell. Leonard eased his hold a fraction, enough for Cale to feel the choice again. "Say nothing," Leonard murmured, "or say what happened." But no more commands that turned pain into policy. Cale's shoulders sagged. For a heartbeat, his eyes softened into something like regret, though whether for the men around him or for himself, Leonard could not tell. The pilot lowered his uninjured hand from the console. In the aisle, the passengers drew a long, collective breath, the sound of a room deciding not to flinch. Somewhere forward, a soft mechanical click sounded, the kind that would be swallowed by engine noise on any other day. Today, it seemed loud. Leonard imagined wires carrying their voices along the spine of the plane, imagined circuits that did not take sides. He glanced at Edwin. The assistant's nod was small but sure. The syringe was secure, the boy steady, the evidence living in more than one place. "Look at me," Leonard said to Cale. The pilot did. "You asked for order. This is the only order left. Truth first." He stepped back half a pace, not as mercy but as definition, granting the pilot a space to stand or to fall. Cale's mouth moved, no words came. His eyes slid again to the green light, to the grill, to the corridor of faces. He understood, he had to, that even if he found a sentence it would float into a system that did not forget. Silence settled, dense and electric. It filled the galley, flowed around the abandoned trays, and pressed against the windows until the cabin lights seemed too bright. In that quiet, a smaller sound emerged, the faint, steady buzz behind the intercom, a humble proof that the circuit was alive. Leonard let his arm lower and held Cale's gaze a beat longer. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply breathed once, deep, as if setting a weight down where it could not be moved again. In his mind, a line formed and held. Whatever came next would arrive to meet proof that could not be coached or hidden. A few rows back, a man cleared his throat. Another tightened a belt knot around Harold's wrists. Victor put his forehead to the carpet and stayed there, chest heaving. Edwin touched the boy's shoulder and then, with deliberate care, placed his palm flat against his own pocket, feeling the cool shape of the syringe through cloth, a promise intact. Cale's lip trembled. "What have you done?" he asked, barely audible. Leonard looked to the small green light and answered without raising his voice. "What you refused to do." He turned his head a fraction toward the speaker grill, and for the first time since the fight began, the corner of his mouth lifted, not in triumph, but in recognition of a fact larger than any man in the aisle. "You opened the door and left it open." The hum behind the grill kept on, patient and tireless. Leonard felt the meaning settle into the metal around them. Every word, every cry, every confession. The plane did not care who wore the uniform or who stood in the aisle. It only cared that sound had become record. Outside the galley, the faces remained raised, the aisle a narrow stage with no curtains left to draw. Leonard tightened his grip on the blade not to threaten, but to remember what had been required to reach this narrow piece. He stood straight, chest lifting once more, and let the quiet speak for him. The plane itself had become the witness no one could silence. Cale lay broken on the galley floor when Victor tried to crawl away, elbows scraping along the ridged aisle as if each groove might hide him from consequence. Leonard caught the movement at the edge of his vision and moved with cold purpose, boots steady despite the rocking cabin. He seized Victor by the collar of his uniform and dragged him into the open aisle, cloth bunching and straining, the attendant's shoes skidding uselessly. "Don't, please," Victor gasped, his voice hitching as his breath fogged the metal trim. His eyes, once hard and mocking, were wide and glassy now, reflecting rows of silent faces. The neat lines of seats had become a witness stand, and every passenger was the jury. Harold came next like a reflex, a desperate spring from the galley's shadow. He led with his shoulder and a choked howl, but the older man with the cane stepped into the narrow aisle with surprising speed. The cane cracked against Harold's shin, a sharp report swallowed by engine hum, and Harold's legs tangled. He pitched forward and hit the carpet with a heavy thud that rattled the tray latches. For a heartbeat, the plane felt still, the kind of stillness that comes after lightning before the roll of thunder. Then voices returned, low, hushed, fractured, men clearing their throats, men muttering prayers under breath, men telling themselves to stand. Belts snapped free of buckles, leather sliding through loops with harsh, decisive sounds. Hands, calloused, trembling, steady, moved as if guided by an instruction they had always known but never practiced. Two passengers knelt on Harold's shoulders, another bound his wrists with a strap torn from a soft-sided case. One man cinched Victor's ankles, his jaw locked tight, sweat purling along his hairline. The cabin lighting, cold and even, made the scene look like a stage stripped of glamour. Only bodies, breath, and intent remained. "Everyone hold," Leonard said, voice pitched low but carrying. He stood over Victor and Harold, chest rising, shoulders squared, the edges of his suit scuffed and flecked with lint from the galley's crushed trays. He did not shout. He didn't need to. Calm gathered around him like a tide, the way it gathers around a pilot's voice during a storm. "We're done moving alone." We moved together. Victor's throat worked. "You don't know what you're doing," he rasped, not quite meeting Leonard's eyes, gaze darting from shoe to seat to aisle light. "You have no idea how this ends." Leonard heard a child's soft whimper behind him and angled his head. Edwin stood at the end of the row, Noah tucked against his chest, the infant's lashes clumped with moisture, his small mouth parted as if searching for comfort. Edwin's face was drawn tight, pallor visible even beneath the overhead lights, but his eyes held steady. He nodded once to Leonard, an unspoken exchange between brothers. "I've got him. Finish this." Leonard returned the nod and faced the men on the floor. Harold tested the bindings, muscle flexing under fabric, but the belts held. He glared up from the carpet and tried to spit a word that would cut. Only air came out. His glare sharpened into a mask of fury at being pinned not by one man, but by many. Dramatic irony pooled there. He and Victor had once relied on the passengers' silence, now that silence had become the very force that held them down. "This cabin has listened to fear too long," Leonard said. His voice ran even, each syllable a plank laid across a river. "It ends now, because every one of us has heard and seen enough to carry the truth onto the ground. No more turning away. No more quiet deals." He lifted his chin to look down the aisle. Men straightened in their seats. The older man with the cane braced it across both palms like a bar, his breath quick but measured. Another passenger, broad-shouldered and sweating through his collar, swallowed hard and said, "We'll stand if you lead." His words were shaky but sincere, and in the simple shape of the statement lay the structure of a new order. No uniforms, no ranks, only resolve. Victor's composure cracked further. "Please," he said, the word thin and quick, the kind that comes from instinct, not strategy. He tried to turn his face toward Leonard, but the belt on his arms bit deeper, and he winced. We... It was pressure. It was policy. You don't understand how this works up there." "Up there doesn't matter," Leonard answered, slicing the air with a small tight shake of his head. He gestured to the scuffed floor, to the steel-colored edges of seat hardware, to the space that had borne witness to every breath and cry. "Only this does. What we do now, what we agree, is acceptable." Harold's mouth curled. "You think these men care when you land?" He spoke through teeth, jaw tense against the carpet. "You'll be called the aggressor. They'll say you incited panic. They'll fold this up in paper and throw it in a drawer. That's how it goes." Always a tremor moved through the aisle, not fear, but recognition. Leonard felt it pass through him, too, an old, familiar current from boardrooms, hearings, and contracts where truth turned to smoke if left unattended. His mind measured the stakes, weighed the optics, mapped the risks like a chessboard he knew by heart. He saw the path they would try to force him onto: apologetic statements, investigations that investigated nothing, a slow suffocation of meaning behind formal words. He tasted the metal of that future and rejected it. He crouched beside Victor, bringing his face level with the man who had once smirked at Cries. "Look at me," Leonard said, not unkindly, not cruelly, just firmly. Victor lifted his eyes, the shape of his fear clear now. Not punishment, but exposure. "This isn't about how I feel. It's about what happened and who must answer for it." In the rear galley, Cale stirred. The pilot's hand twitched against the lip of a storage drawer, fingers dragging weakly. He turned his head, eyes unfocused, breath catching as he tried to form a word. Leonard rose and took 2 steps back. just enough to keep both attendants in view and the pilot within reach. The plane shuddered softly, the kind of small tremor that reminds everyone how high the ground is. "Edwin," Leonard called without looking away. "How is he?" Edwin's voice came steady from the aisle's end. "He's quiet," he said, eyes softening as he glanced down at Noah. "But he's hurting." He lifted his gaze to Leonard, a wall of determination behind it. "Finish it." Leonard drew a long breath that settled in the base of his chest. The air tasted recycled, tinged with plastic and heat and the faint metal of stress. He turned, projecting his voice down the cabin. "Men," he said, because every face he could see was a man's. "Listen. When we touch down, there will be noise. Claims, reports. We don't have to match their noise. We have to match each other. If you saw, you say. If you heard, you say. If you were afraid, you say. Your fear matters because they counted on it." The older man with the cane nodded, his mouth working around words that did not need to come. The nod said enough. Another passenger, younger and flushed, said, "We'll speak." "I'll speak." He tightened the belt around Harold's wrists, not brutally, but with a care that felt like a promise. No further harm, only restraint. A flicker from the galley drew Leonard's eyes. Cale's lips moved. The pilot's face, once composed and distant, had broken into lines of pain and something like shame. Leonard approached, steps slow, careful. The floor hummed beneath his soles, a low, constant reminder of speed and direction. He crouched again, rested one hand on the edge of a storage rack for balance, and leaned close enough to hear the pilot's breath. Cale's eyes found him, the focus sliding into place as if pushed from behind by stubborn will. He swallowed. He tried a word and lost it in the rasp of his throat. The second attempt found purchase. "You think this ends here?" His voice was small, not from lack of confidence but from hurt, a man's body forcing a whisper where once there had been command. His breath carried a faint chemical tang from the galley. "You think they'll let your truth walk off this plane?" Leonard held his gaze. "I think truth has legs," he said, quiet as a held hand. "And I think there are enough of us to carry it." For a moment, Cale looked past Leonard, down the aisle where men held belts, where shoulders blocked aisles, where heads tilted in serious lines. A slight, almost invisible motion passed through his face, like a memory crossing a window. It might have been regret. It might have been calculation. It became neither when he turned his mouth toward Leonard's ear and spoke a final, exhausted line that landed like a shadow on the promise that had gathered in the cabin. His teeth were pink with bitten lip, his breath shallow. He shaped each word with care, a man practicing denial even as he confessed the plan. "The company will bury you before the world hears this." Sirens flared against the fuselage as the cabin doors opened, and a ring of uniformed men moved in with practiced steps, shouting clear orders that bounced off the metal skin of the aircraft. "Hands visible. Remain in your seats," one officer barked, his jaw tight, his eyes darting from Leonard to the passengers who had risen in trembling solidarity. Leonard stood in the aisle with Noah against his chest and Edwin at his shoulder, the scent of jet fuel and the sharp cold of conditioned air pressing into his lungs. His heartbeat slowed to a measured drum. He had braced for this moment. The danger felt different now, less like a blade, more like a net. "Mr. Voss, you'll come with us," another officer said, stepping forward with a clipboard and a practiced neutrality. His gloved hand hovered in the space between caution and command. "There have been reports of violence." "There have also been recordings," Leonard replied, his voice steady, his gaze unblinking as he shifted Noah into Edwin's arms. The infant stirred, a soft, wounded whimper barely audible under the sirens. "You're going to want them." A ripple of voices rose behind him. Men who had stayed silent now found words. "We filmed it," said a passenger near the exit, his phone raised in a trembling hand. "You need to see this." Another added, "There's a syringe, too." The officers traded looks, certainty cracked at the edges. Procedure collided with truth, and truth had a chorus. On the jet bridge, the air turned cool and sterile. Leonard moved first, his hands visible, his posture straight. Edwin followed, careful with Noah's breathing and the small cloth tucked under his chin. An officer stepped alongside them, escorting rather than seizing. Down the corridor, the terminal widened into a field of flashing lights. The wall of cameras appeared like a second horizon, lenses blinking, microphones thrust forward by men leaning on tiptoes, jostling for the cleanest angle. The space hummed with urgency, but the ground beneath Leonard's steps felt solid, as though the weight of evidence anchored him. In a holding room ringed with glass, a plainclothes investigator waited. He introduced himself as Marshal Reeve, his voice even, his face lined with a fatigue that suggested he had seen too many versions of the same story. "Mr. Voss," he began, gesturing to the chairs, "I need to hear it from you." Concise, chronological. He lifted a small recorder and clicked it on. "Start with the moment you realized control was being abused." Leonard spoke in clean lines. He gave names. He described actions and the moments in which silence demanded a reply. He did not raise his voice. He did not embellish. He placed the truth on the table like a set of coordinates. Edwin added details where they belonged. He had timestamps, texts, and the boy's video saved to a backup drive. When the syringe appeared in the narrative, Marshal Reeve leaned forward. "That evidence is secured?" he asked, low and careful. "It is," Edwin answered. "You'll get it on receipt." "It's intact." Outside the glass, men in suits from the airline's response team conferred with tense, clipped gestures. One of them, a communications director with a fixed smile, strode toward the holding room, but an officer held him back. The order of operations had shifted. The narrative no longer waited for a statement. It had one. News of the intercom recording hit within minutes. A technician in the operations bay confirmed that the cabin announcements had fed into the flight's automatic voice log. "Every sound on that channel is secured," he told an officer, tapping a console with decisive fingers. The report reached Marshal Reeve, who looked up from his notes to meet Leonard's eyes. For a heartbeat, caution gave way to something close to resolve. The net had torn. They moved to a press corridor soon after, not because Leonard demanded it, but because silence had become impossible. An officer cleared his throat at the podium and announced that accounts were being taken and that evidence would be examined. It felt rehearsed, yet insufficient. The cameras rolled anyway. Then Leonard stepped forward. He did not shout. He did not posture. He held Noah in the crook of his arm, the infant's small face resting against a soft cloth. The glare of lights washed over them, cutting hard shadow along Leonard's jaw. Edwin stood flanking him, jaw set, a sentry with tired eyes. "This is what happened in the sky today," Leonard said, "and this is what will not be buried on the ground." He explained the sequence again. No theatrics, just the plain force of events. Men in the press queue asked questions at speed. "Did you attack the crew? Was the pilot involved? Are you using this as leverage for your company?" And Leonard met them one by one, anchoring his answers to the recordings. "The evidence speaks," he said quietly. "It can withstand the wind." On a different floor, in a secured room, officers processed Victor and Harold, their suits wrinkled, their faces drained of certainty. Victor kept his chin raised, staring through the glass with the brittle stare of a man who believed a phone call might return the old order. Harold's hands twitched when the word syringe was mentioned. Captain Cale, with bandaged palm and a stunned pallor, stared at a fixed point on the wall, as if looking for a door that used to be there. A medic checked him without comment. The medic's clipboard made small scratch sounds in the quiet, each line a quiet verdict. While officers debated jurisdiction, a new tremor ran through the day. A message slipped to a reporter's phone, then to two more, then to the marshal's desk. It was from an anonymous crewman, male, terse, afraid, who confirmed that discipline on the route had been enforced informally for months, that complaints had been redirected, and that certain staff preferred to make examples. The language was careful, but the confession had heat. It revealed not a broken chain, but a chain designed to bend. "The whistleblower is prepared to testify," an officer said, stepping into the corridor with a paper in his hand. He kept his voice low. "He's asking for protection." "Arrange it," Marshal Reeve answered without looking up. The decision was less dramatic than inevitable. The structure of the story had shifted again, from the violent incident to the roots that fed it. Leonard, hearing the word testify from across the glass, felt the room tilt slightly, as if the plane had banked again. He tightened his hold on Noah, then exhaled. This was the path forward, straight, visible, steep. The airline's first statement arrived at the microphones like a tired script. A public affairs officer, male, carefully composed, declared shock and regret and promised a comprehensive inquiry. He pronounced the word rogue twice. Cameras clicked, Reporters leaned in. When questions pressed toward patterns, the officer widened his eyes in permanent surprise. "This does not reflect our values," he concluded, voice smooth. The words struggled under the weight of the recordings that were already circulating. Leonard did not respond to the statement with rhetoric. He responded with process. He handed over the digital copies, then confirmed the chain of custody. He asked for nothing outside the order of what was rightfully required. When a reporter tried to bait him, "Are you seeking personal revenge?" he looked at the man for one long heartbeat, then shook his head. "I'm seeking measurable change," he said, "and I'm seeking it under oath." By dusk, the airport had become an engine of narratives. In one corner, a local anchor did a stand-up beside a screen that replayed blurred footage from the aisle. In another, a legal correspondent reviewed precedent with a crisp voice and a pen tapping softly on his notes. The terminal windows reflected red strobes into replicas on the polished floor. Men in uniforms rotated at the doors. Men in suits checked their watches and read texts that kept changing 2 words at a time. The world outside, made of silver planes and blacktop, kept moving. The world inside held its breath. In a second holding room, Edwin changed Noah's dressing with a medic's help. The infant stirred, then settled, small fingers curling around the edge of a cotton cuff. Edwin brushed a knuckle gently across the child's brow and glanced at Leonard, who had paused in the doorway. "He's stable," Edwin said, soft but firm, as if he were reporting a market result that mattered more than all others. The medic nodded once and stepped aside. The simplest human details, breathing, sleeping, the clean line of a bandage, were triumphs in a day that had tried to bend toward despair. A clerk entered with forms. Another officer followed with a schedule. The wheels had turned, charges were being considered, statements would be sworn, an arraignment would be set. None of it felt like spectacle now. It felt like a ladder built quickly and carefully, tested with weight before anyone climbed. Leonard signed where required. He asked questions about preservation, about custody, about when the voice logs would be copied and sealed. He kept his answers brief and his tone even. He had learned that the calmest lines were the ones that cut deepest when truth was at stake. Night had fully settled by the time they reached the lobby. The press line had thinned, but a cluster remained, men holding cameras and boom mics with the weary patience of those who knew news did not end. It only changed its clothes. Leonard walked to the microphones one last time. Edwin stood on his right, Noah asleep against his shoulder. The lights were brighter than the stars outside. He spoke about the passengers, men who stood when it counted, men who recorded when recording was the only shield they had. He refused to name his company first. He named the people first. He did not ask for sympathy. He asked for scrutiny. Then he said the line that stitched the day to what had to come next. He looked into the cameras, his voice neither loud nor soft, but exact. He let the last words hold a beat of silence, the kind of silence that follows a landing, the breath that waits for the wheels to touch. The baby, who was silenced, became the reason the world could no longer look away. Moments later, the father struck back. The same screams the attendant tried to stop echoed through him instead. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, cruelty, and violent retaliation against unchecked power. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic injustice, provoke thought about accountability in positions of trust, and inspire action toward dignity, justice, and reform.